I'm Alex, and I never thought being home alone would turn into a nightmare. When the power went out and strange footprints started appearing, I knew I wasn't really alone and whatever was here wasn't human. It was late evening when the power went out, plunging the house into a thick, unnatural silence. The glow from the television died instantly, leaving the living room wrapped in a deep darkness that felt heavier than night itself. The only sound left was the slow, deliberate ticking of the wall clock, each second stretching longer than the last. I stayed frozen on the couch, my phone's dim screen casting a pale light across my hands. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift ever so slightly when I was looking directly at them, as if the darkness was alive and moving. Outside the windows, the night looked different, darker than usual, with no trace of the faint glow from nearby houses. It was as if the neighborhood had been erased, replaced by an endless black void pressing against the glass. I kept glancing toward the curtains, half expecting a shape to suddenly appear there, staring in. I told myself it was just a power cut, nothing unusual, but as the minutes passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air in the house felt heavy and cold, as if the temperature had dropped suddenly. My skin prickled. I decided to check the breaker in the basement, hoping it was a simple fix. When I stood and opened the basement door, the smell hit me immediately, a damp, earthy scent, like wet soil after heavy rain. The darkness below was absolute. I turned on my flashlight, its weak beam cutting a narrow path down the creaky wooden stairs. Halfway down, I stopped. From somewhere deep in the basement came a faint sound, soft, shuffling movements, like bare feet brushing against the concrete floor. I held my breath and scanned the space with the beam, but the light barely reached the far corners. My own breathing sounded too loud, like it didn't belong in the same silence as that faint shuffling. The noise stopped when I reached the bottom step. The breaker panel was right ahead, and I forced myself to walk toward it. My shoes made dull thuds against the floor, but even over that, I could hear the faintest echo of movement, almost like someone matching my steps but just out of sight. When I reached the breaker, my stomach sank. The switches were all in their correct positions. There was no reason for the power to be out. My pulse quickened, a dull ache building in my chest. As I stood there, trying to think of what else could have caused it, a sudden metallic clang echoed from the far side of the basement, sharp and deliberate, as if something had been knocked over. My flashlight beam trembled in my hand as I aimed it toward the sound. I thought I saw movement, something tall and impossibly thin slipping behind the shelves in the far corner. The glimpse lasted only a second, but it was enough to send a rush of cold through me. I took one step toward it, then stopped. The air in that direction felt colder, heavier. My instincts screamed at me to turn around, and I listened. I hurried back to the stairs, my footsteps faster than I wanted them to be, and I didn't let go of the flashlight until I was back in the living room with the basement door shut tight behind me. I stood there for a moment, leaning against the door, listening for any sound from below. Nothing came. The silence felt worse than the noise had. The footprints glistened faintly in the dim light from my phone, each one pressed deep into the carpet, as if whoever made them was far heavier than a normal person. My breathing was uneven, shallow. I couldn't understand how they could be there without me hearing anything. My mind kept replaying the fact that I had been in the basement only seconds before. I had heard nothing following me up the stairs, yet the prints were fresh, so fresh that tiny droplets of water were still trailing from their edges. My legs felt heavy as I stepped back into the hallway. The first door I checked was the bedroom at the end. The door creaked slightly as I pushed it open, revealing a room that should have been comfortingly familiar. But the air was wrong, thick, almost humid, with a faint smell of soil, like freshly dug earth. My gaze was immediately drawn to the closet. The door was wide open, though I never left it that way. Inside, a small pile of clothes sat crumpled on the floor. I knelt down to look closer. They weren't mine. They were old, faded, torn in places, and damp to the touch. They felt cold, as if they'd been left outside in the rain for hours, yet there had been no rain tonight. A thin curtain swayed gently in the breeze from a window that was cracked open just slightly. I walked to the window and peered out. The yard below was empty, dark except for the faint reflection of my own pale face in the glass, but something about the floor beneath me felt wrong, too quiet, too still. I glanced back at the room and noticed that the curtain was swaying more now, though the breeze hadn't changed. That's when I caught the smell, faint but distinct. It was the same earthy scent from the basement, mixed with something more stagnant, almost swamp-like. My eyes shifted to the bed. It sat low to the ground, the gap beneath it, dark and impenetrable. Then came the sound. I tried to distract myself by focusing on the clock on the wall. Its steady ticking was the only normal sound left, and I clung to it like an anchor. But after a while, I realized the ticking had stopped. I looked up, and the sight made my stomach drop. The hands of the clock were both pointing straight down, frozen at exactly 6:30. I hadn't seen them move to that position, they were just suddenly there. The silence deepened. I could hear the faint creak of the old wood under the carpet, like weight shifting somewhere nearby, though nothing in my line of sight was moving. My breath felt loud in my chest. I kept scanning the hallway, my eyes burning from not wanting to blink. That was when I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, just where the light from my phone couldn't quite reach, something pale was peeking out from behind the wall. It was a face deathly white, thin, almost skeletal. The eyes were wide and unblinking, the white so stark against the darkness that they seemed to glow faintly. The mouth was open, stretched unnaturally wide, but no sound came from it. I couldn't move. The hallway was empty again, the shadows undisturbed. I let out a shaky breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My pulse was pounding in my ears, making it hard to hear anything else. But then my gaze fell to the carpet where it had been standing. The fibers were dark, soaked through. A damp patch had spread outward, the edges irregular like the outline of a footprint. pressing down until I could hear the faint thud of my own heartbeat in my ears. It felt like the house was no longer just around, MIT was leaning in, closing me off from the outside world. Eventually I forced myself to stand. I couldn't keep sitting out in the open, not when I didn't know what was in here with me. My mind kept circling back to one thought: find somewhere small. The wind outside whispered faintly through the trees, its rhythm oddly slow, almost matching the rhythm of my breathing. I told myself it was just the weather, but each time the wind faded, the silence felt too exact, too deliberate, as if something was waiting for the right moment to break it. Then came the first knock. It was faint, barely a tap, but it came from the bathroom door, right behind me. My back stiffened instantly. Another knock followed, 3 in total, evenly spaced, soft but deliberate. Then silence again. My mouth was dry as I pressed my ear to the wood. I heard nothing on the other side. I was starting to think it had been my imagination when the knocking returned. When I looked back at the mirror, the shadow was closer. It was pressed right up against the door now, so close that its head seemed to bend unnaturally toward the handle. I wanted to look away, but my eyes wouldn't obey. The knocking came again, harder this time, rattling the thin wood. My hands were shaking as I slid across the floor toward the bathtub. I pulled the curtain closed around me, the plastic brushing against my arms with a sound that felt too loud in the stillness. I held my breath, trying to make myself as small and quiet as possible. The knocking stopped. For several seconds I heard nothing at all. Then the sound of the doorknob turning broke the silence. The lock held at first, but there was a slow, steady pressure against it, as if someone was testing it, not forcing it. Then, with a faint click, the lock gave way. The hinges let out the faintest creak as the door opened, slow enough that I could hear every inch of movement. The curtain blocked my view, but I could feel the shift in the air, the cold that drifted in, heavier and sharper than the night outside. Something stepped inside. The floor tiles groaned under its weight, each step deliberate, measured, moving closer to the tub. I clutched the edge of the curtain so tightly that my fingers ached, my breath locked in my chest. The steps stopped just beside me. Then came the sounds, low, wet breathing, inches away from where I hid. When I finally woke up, I was lying flat on the living room floor, the cold seeping through my clothes like an icy hand gripping my skin. My phone was beside me, its screen cracked and completely dead. The house was still dark, and the power hadn't returned. The silence around me was so thick I could hear my own breath echoing off the walls. I tried to sit up, but my limbs felt heavy, sluggish, as if I'd been asleep for hours longer than I realized. For a moment, I couldn't remember how I got here. My last memory was the bathroom, the knocking, the creaking door, the cold breath close to my face. The fear that had paralyzed me then was still clinging to me now, twisting my stomach into knots. I looked down at my clothes and felt the wetness soaking through the fabric. My shirt and pants were damp, dripping faintly onto the carpet, but there hadn't been any rain, no spills, nothing to explain why I was soaked. I forced myself to stand, swaying slightly as I moved toward the front door. The outside air would be a relief, I thought. Fresh, real, something I could hold on to escape the nightmare inside. But when I reached the door, my hands froze on the handle. It was unlocked. I couldn't remember unlocking it. A cold dread filled me, deeper than anything I had felt so far. Slowly I pulled the door open and stepped outside into the night. The yard was drenched in moonlight, but what caught my eye immediately was the ground-deep muddy footprints trailing away from the house, stretching across the lawn toward the street. My mind screamed for an explanation, some logical reason why they were here, but there was none. Whoever or whatever had left them had walked away from my house into the night, vanishing into the blackness beyond. I turned to go back inside, but as I glanced through the window, something made my blood run cold. In the reflection of the glass, I wasn't alone. Behind me a figure stood just out of reach, tall, thin, and soaked in shadow. Its shape was twisted, like it had been stretched beyond normal proportions, and it seemed to drip water onto the porch, just like the footprints on the lawn. I tried to look behind me, heart hammering, but before I could move, the front door slammed shut with a force that shook the whole house. The sound echoed in the still night, cutting through the silence like a scream. I was trapped. The shadow didn't move, didn't blink, just remained there, an impossibly tall figure watching me from the dark. The coldness radiating from it wasn't just from water or night air. It was something deeper, something that seemed to suck the warmth from everything nearby. My phone, dead and useless on the floor inside, was my only reminder that this was still real. But how could I explain any of this? Who would believe me? I backed away slowly, my eyes never leaving the window's reflection. The figure didn't follow. It didn't disappear. It just waited, like a predator waiting for its next move. And in that moment, I realized I was no longer alone in the house or in the night. Whatever had come through the basement, left the wet footprints, and haunted every corner of this place wasn't finished. It was still here, watching, waiting. I don't know if I'll ever see the morning light again. The door won't open, the power won't return, and the silence outside has been replaced by something else, a presence so cold and so hungry that it feels like the darkness itself has come to claim me. And the worst part, I'm not sure it's even human.